When Belle came to the United States from Norway, she stayed in Chicago with her sister Nellie and eventually married a man named Mads Sorensen. Belle and Mads took in foster children, of course getting paid to do so, and along the way, a couple of the children died. After a while, Mads suddenly died one day after coming home from work. The doctor assumed he had a brain hemorrhage. It became suspicious though, as Mads had a life insurance policy set to expire and a new one to start on the exact day of his death, earning Belle payouts from both. She received somewhere between $5,000 and $8,500. After Mads' death, Belle and her 2 adopted daughters, Myrtle and Lucy, and 1 foster daughter, Jenny Olson, moved to a farm in LaPorte, Indiana on McClung Road. Her life was about to change, and the world was going to hear about Belle Gunness in just a short time later. Welcome to Episode 6, Peter Gunness. Peter Gunness was born January 15, 1872. He was a very handsome widow when he agreed to marry Belle. Belle and Peter had been acquainted before, as he stayed with Belle and her first husband Mads as a boarder in Chicago. A writer once described Peter as, quote, fine-looking blonde Viking of a man with clear blue eyes and a pointed yellow beard and mustache. Peter was also an immigrant from Norway, arriving in the U.S. in 1885. He joined his brother Gust in Minneapolis, then moved to Chicago in 1893. That's when he rented a room from Belle and Mads. Peter moved back to Minnesota, where in June of 1895 he married a young woman named Jenny Sophia Simpson. Peter was an orderman for a grocery store. Their first child was a girl they named Swanhild, born in 1897. 4 years later, Jenny Gunness died while giving birth to their second daughter. After her first husband's death, when Belle went to Minnesota, she made it happen that she got reacquainted with Peter. She put on her charm and somehow coaxed Peter to marry her. On April 1st, 1902, the couple was married in the First Baptist Church of LaPorte by Reverend George C. Moore. Peter was 29 and Belle was 41. Just 5 days into their marriage, Peter's 7-month-old daughter died while in the care of Belle. Her official cause of death was edema of the lungs. Her body was shipped to Chicago to the Forest Home Cemetery beside the remains of the 2 other infants who had died in Belle's care. Just 8 months later, around 3:30 a.m., Tuesday, December 16, 1902, the Gunnesses' nearest neighbors, Swan Nicholson and his family, were awoken by banging on their front door. They found Belle's foster daughter Jenny Olson standing on their porch. The 12-year-old Jenny said to them frantically, "Mama wants you to come up. Papa's burned himself." When Swan and his young son Albert arrived at the Gunness farmhouse, Belle was frantic and barely able to speak. They saw Peter dressed in his long white nightshirt. He was lying face down in the parlor. Nicholson later testified that Peter was laying on his nose and there was blood on the floor. Nicholson also said he knelt down on the floor by Peter to feel for a pulse and try to get him to talk, but Peter gave no answer. Young Albert Nicholson was ordered to run to town to fetch a physician. He was able to rouse Dr. Bo Bowell. When Dr. Bull arrived, he quickly examined Peter, while Swan, Albert, Jenny, and a sobbing Belle stood around in a circle. Dr. Bull could tell that Peter had been dead for a while. The body was already starting rigor mortis. The back of his head had a large wound with thick caked blood, and his nose was broken and bent to one side. The doctor's immediate impression was that Peter Gunness had been murdered. By this time, Belle became almost hysterical. The doctor seated her in the kitchen to find out what happened. Her story raised more questions than answers. Her story basically went that Peter went to the kitchen to get his shoes that he kept near the stove to keep warm. As he bent down to get them, a meat grinder fell off a shelf above and struck him on the back of his head, and a pot of hot brine on the stove fell over, burning the back of his neck. Belle continued to say after all this, he told her he'd be okay and went to lay down. and a few hours later she found him dead on the parlor floor. The doctor found her story suspicious, but wanted to wait for an autopsy to make any conclusions. Young Albert Nicholson told his father as they walked back home that he was certain Peter Gunness was murdered by Belle. His father told him not to say anything to anyone as he did not want any trouble with Mrs. Gunness. The very next day, the newspapers were at it with a headline in the Fort Wayne Daily News saying, "Crime of high degree." A string of tragedies had taken place in LaPorte, leaving residents mourning several losses. Wesley Reynolds was killed in a shootout with two would-be bank robbers who murdered grocer John Koonsman. Police were also trying to track down the person who had sent a box of arsenic-laced bonbons to a young servant girl named Matilda Baker, who ate all of the candy. Also, the mother of 17-year-old George Shearer was almost murdered by her son as he became suddenly demented and tried to kill her with a carving knife. Peter Gunness's death was just another mysterious string of events happening in LaPorte. The autopsy seemed like foul play to Dr. Bull, and he was determined to get the truth, so he announced his intentions to get a jury and conduct an inquest. The inquest took place on Thursday, December 18, 1902, at the Gunness farmhouse in the room where Peter died. Belle was the primary witness, where she went through a lengthy interrogation by Dr. Bull and his clerk, Louis H. Oberreich. When asked to describe the events of that night, Belle told that after putting the children to bed, she went to the kitchen to stuff sausage casings with the freshly butchered pork Peter had ground for her. When she was finished, she washed the meat grinder, then went into the parlor where Peter was reading a newspaper. She went on to tell the meat grinder story. Jenny Olson was also questioned, and she seemed to have been coached by Belle on what exactly to say. The inquest concluded with testimony of Swan Nicholson. He said he didn't see any burns on Peter or any blood on the couch where Peter had gone to lie down after his injuries. But he said he thought Belle was telling the truth. The residents of LaPorte were not fooled at the thought of Belle being innocent. Most of the community didn't believe her story. They knew she killed Peter Gunness. Peter's funeral was held on Friday, December 19th in the parlor of the Gunness farmhouse. The rites were conducted by Reverend George C. Moore, the same minister who had married Peter and Belle 8 months earlier. A chronicler of the case said he witnessed Belle moaning with her fingers before her eyes as the preaching began. But young Albert Nicholson reported that she was peering alertly between them to check the effect she was making. Young Albert remained convinced that Belle murdered Peter, and he went against his father's wishes and told people exactly how he felt. It came to a shock to many LaPortians when Dr. Bull issued his findings on the same day Peter was buried at Patton Cemetery. The findings read, "After having examined the body and heard the evidence, we so find that the deceased came to his death by the accidental falling of the auger part of a sausage mill falling from the heating shelf of cook stove in his kitchen and striking him on the back of the head. The impact of said auger part of sausage mill causing fracture of skull and intracranial hemorrhage resulting in death." The report put an end to the case of Peter Gunness, but rumors still swirled around. Little Myrtle Sorensen, only 5 years old at the time of her stepfather's death, whispered in the ear of her classmate friend, "My mama killed my papa, she hit him with a meat cleaver, and he died. Don't tell a soul." Has Belle killed her second husband? Or do you think Peter Gunness died by a freak accident? Find out more of the story in episode 7 coming soon. Thank you, and like and subscribe for more.